Justice, my sister, ran away from home when she was 18 years of age, or so for many years I thought. My parents were vague on the cause of her disappearance, and all matters pertaining to my sibling come to that. A saint was all my father would say of her. She was a saint in the eyes of God. An angel, my mother would insist. That's all you need to know. They would admit no fault in her absence, and yet I sensed something false in their praise and winced to hear it from such bitter mouths as theirs. I'd feared both of my parents for as long as I could recall, which is a pitiful sort of existence for a child to know. They belonged to some evangelical religion that devoured them through its miserable hold, being that their conduct in all things was not as individuals, but as the mortal enactors of their severe and joyless faith. I feared to trespass their rules or express any complaint, lest they, by force, grind it out. The house was perpetually cold, a temple of grueling worship in which toys or television or casual literature were forbidden. Each room instead committed to such quantities of religious paraphernalia that there was scarce space in them to move. I knew from savage paragraphs of my parents' beloved texts that all suffering was holy and corporal punishment just one means of pain listed among them. To be spared other agonies was a gift rarely granted, only the act of killing forbidden. The only reason my parents had never once raised a hand to me by my recollection was that being a mute, shy, and anxious child, I had given them no true cause. So it was that I did not ask about my sister, only imagined 1,000 configurations of destiny that might well have befallen her. After years of pure behavior she had trespassed, I suspected had disobeyed a curfew, tasted alcohol, or exulted in the touch of men. My mother would wash her hands and rock with mumbled prayer at the rare utterance of her name alone. In this way, I knew my sister's failure as it was written in the law of my parents' holy works. They had put justice out on the street, perhaps, or else she had run from them, leaving me, a boy of then just 6, alone in the harsh church that was our house. By the end of the following decade, I was desperate to join my sister in the world beyond. But having never been permitted to work by my parents or been given sufficient allowance to hide away, I was jailed there, groomed to be the prophet of their faith. I took to pacing the house in obsessive repetition by habit, particularly when my parents absented themselves to proselytize in the poor quarters of the city in which they felt the word was most needed. Sometimes I stood at the thin, high windows of that hideous abode and considered leaping to a sinful death on the grey street below. But thoughts of my sister prevented me, for I had hopes still of meeting her again. I envisioned her coiled like an ammonite in the sheath of an old sleeping bag, somewhere or against the back of a faceless lover in an apartment beyond our parents' reaches, dancing on a stage under lights like gasoline on a black road in all their lurid colours. So many images of justice I conceived of, some of them happy, others lonely glances at the fringes to which my mother and father have thrust her in their rejection. But not once in my grim musings did I suppose that she was dead. I knew there was some possibility of it. Perhaps my father had struck her down in a holy rage, or she had seized in the grasp of drugged overdose in the infected womb of the city, or starved there. Yet my parents' belief that it was a sin to outright take a life was so strong that I could not conceive of them having any hand in it. And for reasons inexplicable, I was certain that no other death had claimed her. That justice had disappeared led me to think that I too may likewise fade from view, however. My parents' obsession with me standing as some great example of their religion disturbed me in its fervour. My name was often uttered in their prayers, my photograph placed beneath the shrine of crosses they knelt, to where other families observed the glass face of a machine. They had no reason to think I did not share in their delusion, for through fear I'd clasp my hands and mouth to God as they did, and so I seemed devout. But I had no want of their baleful religion of self-abasement, and as the months went on and my fixation with my sister's vanishing expanded, I at last dared to ask my mother if justice had always been as saintly as they claimed. She was, my mother insisted, Our good girl that she was. But we had a fear she'd change when she got older. She was always having notions of leaving us. Well, we prayed on it, and God saw fit to make a saint of her. So all she'd be remembered for was the good she'd done, and not the sins that might have come after. Fire and brimstone licks us all around the ankles, child, but through his love we're saved. She touched my cheek with one cool hand, and I cringed from the zeal in that caress. The look in her eyes that was a blindness in the seeing of what was not there. You're so like her, you know, my mother said. You're good. A credit to your faith. I'm not, I signed. But as always, she misread the frustration in my gestures and took me gently by the hand. Oh, love, you don't have to speak for people to hear the word. You're enough. It was the kindest sentiment my mother had ever expressed to me, and in other circumstances I might have taken comfort in it. But being that I was no believer, it only drove my fear and melancholy deeper into me. Once my mother had gone out into the city with her pamphlets, my father presumably with her, I resumed my wandering of the house again, thinking of Justice, whose face I knew better from photographs than from the tatters I had left of memory. A soft, pale face she'd had, like the bead of a pearl rosary, eyes like the glow that accompanied sirens in the night. She looked as my mother had done when she was young, before the whittling of the order had made a haggard branch of her. I wondered if Justice had gone that way, and if I too would be incised merely by proximity to my parents' beliefs. By the time my pacing led me to the top of the house, I again felt the call of those tall windows. So ensnared was I by the terror of my fate that this seemed my only egress. It was as I stood pressed to their murky glass that I became aware of distant music above me, much like the recordings my mother would play while kneeling to our shrine of saints. I stared up at the ceiling, momentarily bewildered. Only when my eyes touched the outline of the door to the attic did it occur to me that this room, which I had never entered, was the source of that dark melody. To my knowledge, the loft had rarely been used except for storage purposes, and so I'd had no cause or interest to explore it. Now, attracted by the strain of mysterious song, I went to fetch a broom from a nearby cupboard and prodded the attic door until the ladder descended. At once, the yellow glow of candlelight fell upon me, and with it the odors of incense and human habitation, such as I had smelled sometimes in the street-side gatherings of religious fanatics my parents frequented. left that room open to me, I knew I could not carry my sister from the house alone. Though smaller and lighter than I, her new body was so oddly shaped that I wouldn't have known how best to hold or to transport her without causing her harm or distress. Her mind, it seemed, had been reduced by pain to something primitive. She could not speak, and though my parents addressed her frequently, I saw no comprehension in her stare of what they uttered in her presence. They were glad of that, I'm sure. A saint to them was like an infant, pure of thought, without autonomy, a symbol of all projected upon them by their followers. I wanted better for justice than that, and so upon returning to school, I made haste to communicate in writing of the abuses I had witnessed and those I myself had suffered. Only my young age and the severity of what had been done to me had rid me of that memory, though through my father's revelation I seemed to distantly recall it. These details I presented to my teacher, who, though vaguely skeptical, had me remain at school while the police were contacted and dispatched to my house. Upon their arrival, they found the building empty, though with evidence of recent abandonment, the customary disarray further disturbed by the hurried emptying of drawers and wardrobes. The attic had been similarly gutted, though found there were sheets and blankets stained with blood and other bodily matter that supported my claim strongly enough to spur an immediate investigation. Why my parents had allowed me to leave their keep, if they suspected my betrayal, I do not know. Perhaps they realized I would not be so easily subdued as my sister had been, and so seized the chance to fly with her in my absence. Yet there is some part of me convinced that they had no inkling of my intent to speak out against them until I had already departed, that they had afterwards received some sign of it, either imagined by them or else spiritually delivered by God or saint. I may not have followed their religion, but some sediment of its superstition followed me, even to foster care, where I should well have been released from its influence. My restless habit of wandering persisted also, which in taking me through the city, lost in contemplation of my family's disappearance, led me to hear amongst the vagrants and the preachers there of a changed branch of their strange sect. The Holy Order of Saint Justice, they called it, my only proof that my parents and sister remained in that place 3 years after. I looked for them in the streets and shabby buildings, to which their circle was ordinarily drawn, intent on acting as the law had failed to in liberating my sister from them. Each time I imagined I'd uncover her, where I sought, set upon some overturned box made an altar, her tortured body and eyes without thought lit by the reeking flame, her congregants each prayed by. Yet in the catacombs, we called our city, my parents had hidden her too well for me to find, for they had always loved the result of her suffering more than they did justice and I.